October 17th, 2019, 3 in the afternoon. 35 soldiers drove into one of Culiacan's wealthiest neighborhoods and knocked on a door. The man inside was unarmed, unguarded, sitting with his family like it was any other Thursday. His name was Ovidio Guzmán López. His father was El Chapo. He surrendered immediately without a shot fired. 4 people in the house, and the arrest by any standard measure had gone perfectly. Within 40 minutes, the city was at war. Not one block, not one neighborhood. The whole city airport sealed highways, burning soldiers pulled from their barracks in front of their children. Hundreds of armed men had materialized from nowhere, moving through Culiacan streets with heavy machine guns and mounted weapons, cutting the city into sealed zones with the precision of something long rehearsed. Because it had been. The operation looked clean because nobody outside that house knew yet what was coming. 35 soldiers and the son of the most wanted man in Mexican history, standing in a living room that smelled of Sunday lunch while outside a city, was discovering what it meant to belong to someone else. By nightfall, Ovidio walked out of that house a free man. The soldiers left. The government started looking for words to explain what happened. Someone had handed him a phone. That moment, the phone, the call, the brother on the other end who said no, is where this story actually begins. On July 17th, 2019, 3 months before October 17th, a federal judge in New York sentenced Joaquín Guzmán Loera to life in prison. His sons were watching. By the time the convoy drove into Tres Rios that afternoon in October, the man who built the Sinaloa Cartel was already gone. What remained were his 4 sons and a U.S. government that wanted one of them extradited. The cartel did not collapse when El Chapo went to prison. That was the assumption, and it was wrong. The 4 Chapitos, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo Ovidio, and Joaquin, had been learning the business for years. Leadership was shared across the brothers, though Ovidio played a significant role in the production and supply chain of methamphetamine and fentanyl. By 2017, when El Chapo was extradited to stand trial in Brooklyn, Los Chapitos and El Mayo Zambada were running Sinaloa together. The empire had changed hands without a single shot at the top. El Chapo had always run his operation from inside walls. From Puente Grande prison in 2001, through intermediaries by phone, he called shots across locked doors for years before the tunnel and the motorcycle and the escape. His sons inherited that model. The cartel ran on chains of command that could stretch from a federal courtroom in New York to a laboratory in Culiacán to a street corner in Chicago without missing a step. Ovidio understood this. He had grown up inside it. The phone was not just a tool in this family, it was infrastructure. But Ovidio was different from his brothers. He was not the eldest, and he did not command the international network the way Jesus Alfredo did, or the plaza infrastructure the way Ivan did. His bodyguard unit, Las Fuerzas Especiales Ratón, was company-sized, not an army. What set him apart was not power, it was exposure. On February 21, 2019, a U.S. federal grand jury in Washington unsealed an indictment against him. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine, methamphetamine, and marijuana for importation into the United States. The paperwork had existed since 2012. OFAC had sanctioned him under the Kingpin Act 7 years before the indictment was unsealed. The Americans had been building the case for years. Now they wanted delivery. The drug angle was not incidental. Ovidio's faction was deeply involved in the large-scale production of both methamphetamine and fentanyl. U.S. authorities estimated his operation was producing between 1,360 to 2,200 kilograms of methamphetamine per month, while Los Chapitos were simultaneously emerging as one of Mexico's principal fentanyl suppliers. The U.S. overdose crisis was in part a logistics problem. The logistics ran through Culiacán. Washington had clear reason to want that supply chain cut. Mexico had treaty obligations and an extradition relationship that made refusal complicated. Ovidio was not the most powerful son. He was the most reachable son. The convoy drove into Tres Rios on a Thursday afternoon with 35 men and no search warrant. The assumption was that the capture would be clean a drug lord with no public profile, no visible security, no apparent reason to expect what was coming. The assumption was correct. He surrendered without a word of resistance. For 40 minutes, Mexico held El Chapo's son in a living room and believed it had done something remarkable. Then everything that had been waiting outside that living room arrived at once. The first narco-bloqueos appeared within minutes of the arrest, not one or two, not a neighborhood skirmish, but 19 simultaneous blockades spread across Culiacán's major arteries. Burning tractor trailers across highway entrances, stolen buses jammed across bridge approaches. More than 50 civilian vehicles seized from ordinary people driving home from work, repositioned at intersections across the grid. This was not arson. This was architecture. Each blockade locked a zone. Military reinforcements inside their barracks could not move. Police could not move. The 35 soldiers holding Ovidio in that living room were not being surrounded. They were being sealed inside a city that was closing around them like a fist. The map had been cut before anyone called for help. Then the weapons appeared. Trucks mounted with heavy machine guns, including .50 caliber weapons, rolled through intersections where 20 minutes earlier, children had been walking home from school. Barrett anti-material rifles built to punch through armored vehicle plating appeared at cartel checkpoints. Multiple technical civilian pickup trucks, converted into mobile gun platforms, were deployed at key positions across the city. This was not the equipment of sicarios defending a corner. This was the pre-positioned arsenal of an organization that had rehearsed for exactly this scenario, cataloged the city's strategic points, and stored hardware near each one. When the activation signal came when Ovidio's hands were zip-tied in that living room, the trucks were already moving. The airport went next. The road leading to it was blocked. A military helicopter that attempted to survey the city from the air was shot at and forced to withdraw. At the same time, direct attacks began on the military's own barracks across Culiacán, cartel gunmen going not to the house where Ovidio was held, but to the institutional buildings of the state itself, making clear that no reinforcement from inside the city would be forthcoming. The 35 soldiers were cut off from every direction. No cavalry was coming. There were 35 men in the living room and outside a city in full tactical siege. Then the cartel opened a second front the soldiers had never trained for. Gunmen entered the March 21st military residential complex, where dozens of military families lived their daily lives a kilometer from the chaos. They fired into the air. They made the terms plain Ovidio walks free or the families inside do not. At least 60 military families were forced to evacuate to the 9th Military Zone headquarters. At least 8 soldiers had already been taken hostage from separate operations across the city. At least one was seized from his barracks in front of his own children. The cartel had bracketed both sides of every soldier's life in under an hour: the mission and the family, the duty and the door, the man with the gun and the children waiting for him at home. Across the city at the Aguarudo Cerezo Penitentiary, the third front dissolved from the inside. Inmates rioted, overpowered guards, and walked out. Approximately 51 prisoners, the majority of them with documented cartel ties, escaped into Culiacán during the same hours the blockades were burning. The coordination was structural, not coincidental. The prison break was another ring tightening around those 35 soldiers. While they fought to maintain a position on the street, the state's own containment infrastructure was coming apart at the seams. A 14-year-old was killed in Tres Rios during the crossfire. Band member Pavel Frias from the group Arte Norte witnessed the body from the street. No name has ever appeared in any public record for that child. By now, the soldiers inside the house had no reinforcements coming. Their families were under siege. The city had been surgically dismembered around them. The clashes had been running for hours with no end visible. They were 35 men in a room holding a man whose brother had just demonstrated that Culiacán belonged to the cartel not as a statement of ideology, but as a logistical fact. Someone handed Ovidio a phone. A soldier explained, "Call your brother. Call Ivan. Tell him to stop." Ovidio Guzmán López made the call. Ivan Archivaldo Guzmán Salazar, the eldest, Chapito. The one who had spent a decade building the armed infrastructure now visible on every street in Culiacán, said no. He didn't negotiate. He didn't hesitate. He ordered the assault to continue and to escalate. The man who surrendered without a fight was asking for peace. The man who was free was choosing war. Ovidio's words were recorded. Mexico's defense secretary released the video 13 days later. "Ya paren todo, inmediatamente paren todo, ya me entregué, ya ni modo. Stop everything immediately. I've surrendered. There's no other way." His brother had already decided there was another way. By 7:17 that evening, Ovidio Guzmán López walked out of his mother-in-law's house a free man. The soldiers drove away. The fires smoldered. Raúl Benítez, a Latin American armed conflict expert, later put it plainly. The Sinaloa Cartel demonstrated a tremendous ability to mobilize rapidly and take effective control of the city. They showed that in Sinaloa, they are the ones who run things. And the Mexican government began preparing its explanation. Ovidio was barely out of the house before the government started explaining what had happened. Alfonso Durazo, Mexico's Secretary of Security, spoke to Reuters on the night of October 17th itself. His statement was clean and direct. The soldiers took the decision to leave the house without Guzmán to try to avoid more violence. An improvised withdrawal, a field-level judgment made by the men on the ground. Nobody at the top had ordered anything. Things had simply happened, and the soldiers had responded as best they could. This was version 1. It pushes blame downward to the 35 soldiers, to the commanders, who were standing in a living room under fire from a city in revolt. It protects the presidency entirely. Nobody decided. Things just happened. The next morning, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador appeared at his daily press conference. His version was different. La decisión fue tomada por el Gabinete de Seguridad de manera colectiva. Yo la respaldé. No tengo ningún arrepentimiento. The decision was taken by the Security Cabinet collectively. I supported it. I have no regrets. This was version 2. It spreads responsibility horizontally across the Cabinet, the Defense Secretary, the Security Secretary, the collective body of the executive branch. Nobody is solely accountable. AMLO supported a decision he did not make alone. The president is present in this version, but cushion distributed across a table full of other people who also agreed. 2 versions, 2 different accounts of the same event given by the same government within 12 hours. The first said the decision was made in the field. The second said the decision was made in the cabinet. These 2 facts cannot both be true. 8 months passed. On June 19, 2020, AMLO appeared at his morning press conference and said something neither version had contained. Yo ordené que se detuviera ese operativo y que se dejara en libertad a este presunto delincuente. I ordered the operation stopped. I ordered this alleged criminal released. This was version 3. It reverses direction entirely. AMLO takes the decision back, claims it as his own, places himself at the center of an event he had previously described as collective. By June 2020, the political landscape had shifted. The Culiacanazo had become a settled story, and that story's verdict was already forming. Owning the decision was more useful than being blamed for a decision someone else made. A president reclaiming a narrative by admitting what he could no longer afford to deny. 3 versions: a withdrawal by frightened soldiers, a collective cabinet judgment, a presidential order. The same event told 3 different ways by the same people over 8 months. Then, Alfonso Durazo testified under oath in the Senate. Nadie decidió liberar a Ovidio. Nunca tuvimos una orden de aprehensión. Lo que hicimos fue ordenar a nuestro personal que se retirara. Nobody decided to release Ovidio. We never had an arrest warrant. What we did was order our personnel to withdraw. This statement given under oath makes all 3 previous versions impossible simultaneously. If nobody decided version 2 is false, there was no cabinet decision to support. If there was no arrest warrant, the legal foundation of the entire operation was fictitious from the moment the convoy left. And if what happened was a withdrawal, rather than a release, then even AMLO's version 3, his own admission that he gave the order, is a false framing of what occurred. 4 statements. They cannot all be true. At least one was given under oath. General Sandoval added his own assessment of the operation the elements had participated in a precipitated manner with deficient planning and lack of foresight. The institution's own leader was confirming the failure while the president was still arranging the words. The phone the soldiers handed Ovidio had become in the government's telling a prop in a story nobody would ever fully own. Version 1 said the soldiers decided. Version 2 said the cabinet decided. Version 3 said the president decided. The Senate testimony said nobody decided. Each version was a call to the truth that went unanswered. What the government said about October 17th kept changing. What AMLO believed about governing Mexico did not. A poll conducted in Sinaloa found that 79% supported the decision to release Ovidio Guzmán. Not reluctantly, not with reservations, supported it. Nationally, the figure stood at approximately 53%. AMLO had a name for the philosophy behind those numbers: abrazos, no balazos, hugs, not bullets. The idea was that a state breaks the cycle of violence by refusing to feed it, that social programs, not military operations, were the instrument of lasting peace. October 17th was the most expensive test of that idea in Mexican history. From outside Mexico, from the international press, from analysts in Washington, from the offices of the U.S. government, whose extradition request had triggered the operation. What the Mexican state did on October 17th was surrender. A fugitive drug lord wanted by a treaty partner was captured, held, and released under armed pressure. The government blinked. The cartel won. Full stop. From inside Mexico, from Culiacan's residents who lived under the burning blockades, from the families evacuated from the March 21st complex, from the 79% across Sinaloa who answered the pollster, the government did something different. It chose 200 lives over one arrest. It calculated that releasing Ovidio was worth less than the body count that holding him would have produced in a city that already averaged 40 murders per month. AMLO did not blink. He calculated. Most of the people he governed agreed with the math. These two perspectives do not cancel each other out. They sit alongside each other, permanent and unresolved. AMLO himself put his position plainly. You can't fight fire with fire. We don't want deaths. We don't want war. With justice, we will guarantee peace and tranquility in the country. Jorge Castañeda, writing in the New York Times, offered the other ledger. The Battle of Culiacán illustrates that the Sinaloa Cartel is no weaker today than before the war on drugs began. Juan Grillo, who had spent years reporting from inside Mexico's narco conflict, described what the cartel had just demonstrated as more like an insurgency than a criminal operation. Culiacán did not only ask whether the government was right or wrong. It asked how far a state is permitted to retreat before that retreat becomes a precedent. That question would not be answered in any press conference. It surfaced instead 5 days later on October 22nd, when retired General Carlos Gaitan stood at a public podium and spoke about today's Mexico. He did not mention Culiacán by name. He did not need to. He referenced strategic decisions that haven't convinced everyone, to put it mildly. Washington Post sources later confirmed what everyone in that room already understood. The general was speaking directly about the humiliation his institution had just been asked to absorb. He was precise, measured, and entirely devastating. A man who had spent his career inside the apparatus of Mexican military power, now standing at a lectern and saying in the most careful language available to him that something had gone badly wrong. The context in which AMLO inherited this country mattered. When he took office in December 2018, Mexico had recorded more than 33,300 homicides, a national record. A decade of military confrontation with cartels had produced staggering body counts and fractured communities without dismantling a single major criminal organization. AMLO believed the war on drugs was broken. He ran on that belief and won. By that metric, October 17th was not a failure of policy, it was an application of it. But policy and consequence are different things. The Culiacanazo was a call the Mexican state placed to its own authority, and nobody picked up. The unanswered question it left behind was not whether AMLO's philosophy was coherent. It was whether once a state has retreated publicly enough times, the retreat stops being a choice. The analysts argued. The generals gave careful speeches. In Culiacán, a band sat down in a recording studio and wrote the history of the afternoon. By morning, the streets had been cleared. The burned trucks were gone. The shops reopened. On the surface, Culiacán looked normal. Underneath, something had cracked that would not close. That same night, starting around 9 p.m. on October 17th and running through 5 in the morning, a banda group called Arte Norte sat in a recording studio and composed a corrido about everything that had just happened. The song was called Ovidio Guzmán El Rescate. By 7 a.m., it was online. By the end of the week, it had spread to Guatemala, and Tijuana, been picked up by local newscasts on both sides of the border, played as background music while anchors read the news. The cartel had issued its own press statement in 3/4 time, but the corrido that mattered most came later. Soy el Ratón, recorded by Código FN and featuring Edwin Cas of Grupo Firme, gave Ovidio a voice the phone call never had. Through the lyrics, he addressed Culiacán directly. Y por cierto me disculpo por lo del Culiacanazo, yo no peleé, pues la vida de mis hijas fue primero, y agradezco a la plebada el jueves negro, se rifaron por mi cuero. By the way, I apologize for the Culiacanazo. I didn't fight. My daughters' lives came first. I thank the people for Black Thursday. They risked their lives for mine. This was a cartel boss issuing a public apology through banda music, heard by hundreds of thousands of people who had lived through what he was apologizing for. The last time Ovidio had spoken into a phone, a soldier was holding it and the city was on fire. This time, nobody handed him anything. This was his call placed on his own schedule, in his own words, to a city that had burned for him. On December 3, 2019, 6 weeks after October 17th, unconfirmed rumors of new armed clashes triggered a wave of panic across Culiacán. Schools dismissed students early. Many residents stayed off the streets. Nothing happened. But the city had already evacuated itself from memory, from reflex from a fear response installed on that Thursday afternoon that could not be uninstalled by the absence of gunfire. Culiacán had learned to run before the shooting started. That is what October 17th left behind. Approximately 51 prisoners escaped from the Aguaruto Cerezo that afternoon. Only 6 were recaptured within a year. 45 men walked out of state custody on October 17, 2019, and remained at large for years afterward. Some doors opened that afternoon have never closed. 40 months later, the Mexican government tried again. This time, they did not knock on the door at 3 in the afternoon. They arrived at 3:35 in the morning. 12 Special Forces soldiers, 6 months of prior intelligence. A ranch 45 kilometers outside Culiacán in the municipality of Jesus Maria, where nobody was waiting because nobody had been warned. The operation had been built from the ground up around every lesson. October 17th had produced with a warrant with authorization, with far less left to improvise. The comparison held up Axis by Axis is its own kind of indictment of what 2019 had been. Time of day, 2019. Broad daylight, a residential neighborhood, every neighbor a potential lookout for the cartel's surveillance network. 2023, 3:35 a.m. before sunrise, the city's eyes still closed. Location 2019 inside Culiacán, a city the Sinaloa Cartel had mapped, street by street, wired at every arterial point, and pre-positioned for exactly this kind of activation. 2023, 45 kilometers outside that grid, past the range of the urban infrastructure the cartel had spent years building. Intelligence 2019 improvised, operating on an opportunity with no warrant and no preparation for the counterattack that everyone who understood the cartel knew would follow. 2023, 6 months of prior work. Ovidio was asleep in his bedroom when 12 Special Forces soldiers entered without triggering a single alarm. Preparation for the response 2019. None. Military family housing left exposed, barracks unfortified. No reaction force staged anywhere in Sinaloa. 2023 military family housing reinforced before the first soldier moved toward Jesus Maria. Ground and air reaction forces pre-positioned across the state. General Luis Crescencio Sandoval stated it directly, taking his experience. October 17, 2019. We reinforced security at military installations, we intensified training, we provided ground and air reaction forces to fulfill the main mission. The cartel's 2023 response was more organized than 2019. 26 armored vehicles, Barrett anti-material rifles, RPG-7 launchers, 40mm grenade launchers. They attacked the international airport and the military airbase simultaneously. They established 19 roadblocks across Culiacán. The playbook was identical, the same city, the same logic of siege, the same intention. But the U.S. had offered $5 million for Ovidio's capture, and the state had spent 40 months making sure it would not have to make the same choice twice. This time, the soldiers held. 10 soldiers died to hold that line. Ovidio was loaded onto a military aircraft and flown to Mexico City the same morning, then transferred to Altiplano Maximum Security Prison. In September 2023, he was extradited to the United States. The outcome, the February 2019 indictment, had been written to produce 4 years earlier. In 2025, in a federal courtroom in Chicago, he pleaded guilty to 4 charges. He faces life in prison. The man who called his brother to stop the fire, whose brother refused, is now in the jurisdiction, whose extradition request started everything. The state learned. It cost 10 lives to learn it. On October 17, 2019, a man whose faction ran one of Mexico's largest drug production operations surrendered to 35 soldiers in his mother-in-law's house. He asked for peace. His brother said no. The city burned. The government gave 3 contradictory accounts of who made the decision. And a year later, 45 of the 51 men who escaped from Culiacán's prison that afternoon still had not been found. The phone the soldiers handed Ovidio was not the moment the state failed. The failure had already happened in the decision to send 35 soldiers with no warrant into a city that belonged to someone else. In the 3 contradictory versions that followed, none of which survived contact with the others. In the 45 prisoners, still living their 2nd and 3rd and 4th years of accidental freedom. The phone was just the moment the failure became visible.